You're watching GAB with ALisa Profiles on MetroCast Channel 10. Thanks for joining me. Today, a wonderful program as we talk to our guest about connections. Every time I do one of these interviews, I try to think of one word that completely encompasses the interview that we're going to present to you, and today that word is connections. We're going to talk to Professor David Kung from St. Mary's College. He's a professor of mathematics and also a semi-professional musician. And right away you're thinking, math, music, differences? Also similarities and connections. A wonderful program. So grab a glass of iced tea, kick back, and get ready for a wonderful show as we profile David Kung on MetroCast Channel 10.
Why smart people buy their used cars from Jack Fitzgerald. Reason number 1.
The most important reason to buy a car from us is our 138-point inspection report. We check the car out thoroughly, and we put a copy of that report in your glove compartment so that you know as much about that car as we do before you buy it.
Shop our entire used car inventory at fitzmall.com.
And that's the Fitz way. There's just no better way to go.
You're watching GAB with ALisa Profiles on MetroCast Channel 10. Thanks so much for joining us. Today, an incredible guest. I am so excited to introduce you to Professor David Kung from St. Mary's College. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
I have to tell you, truth be told, I feel like a little kid because I'm so excited about the topic that we have on this particular interview. You're such an incredibly interesting person, and that's the whole point of GAB with ALisa Profiles. I love this. I love sitting down and talking to people that do incredible things where they are, and that's going to be what we're going to talk about today. You are a math professor for St. Mary's College. You also play the violin and a surprise instrument that we'll get to later in this program, and you do incredible things with the knowledge that you have. So let's kind of roll back a little bit and talk about you first of all. The first thing I want to ask you, because words are important to me, and names are also important to me. Your last name, Kung, K-U-N-G, is how it's spelled. How is it pronounced properly?
So if you speak Chinese, if you speak Mandarin Chinese, it's Gong. But you know, I grew up in Wisconsin, and I go by Kung. That's
okay,
fine.
okay. And it's I ask you that because names are so important today, and to be able to take a name and really have an identification with somebody and understand who they are and where they come from. Now, you grew up in Wisconsin?
Yes.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about your growing up. What was it like?
It was great. I grew up in a small town, about 30,000 people, right in central Wisconsin. It was significantly colder and snowier than it is here in Maryland.
Yes.
But it was a wonderful childhood.
Now, you mentioned that your name is Mandarin in root and origin. Is your family from China?
So my father was born in mainland China, and he moved around quite a bit. He ended up doing his high school at a Canadian school in Japan. There were not a whole lot, if you know your history, there were not a whole lot of Chinese living in Japan post World War II. That was not a really close relationship, shall we say.
Right.
But then he came to the U.S. for college, and he moved to Texas first, and then he moved to California and met my mother.
Oh, and you ended up in Wisconsin.
We ended up in Wisconsin. My mother is Danish by origin, but grew up in northeast Iowa.
Now, have you had any opportunity, I know you live here in Maryland and you've been at the college for about 15 years, have you had an opportunity to visit China, spend any time there?
I have. I didn't learn any Chinese when I was growing up, but I learned Chinese in college, and then I took a sabbatical, and so my family and I went to Shanghai in 2007, 2008, and lived there for a year. Wow. And my son, my stepson, we put him in Chinese public schools. He was 10 at the time, and he learned Mandarin Chinese. He speaks with a much better accent than I do.
Children are such a sponge, and you're a teacher, and I know that you know that children are such a sponge. I lived in Berlin, Germany for a few years, and my daughter was 6 at the time, and we put her in a German-American Schule, and she picked up German.
It's amazing.
It makes sense to them,
right.
Just the translation, what have you. We could spend hours and hours talking about your history and your background and your languages, because you also speak a little bit of German and French, right?
Ein bisschen.
Okay, there you go. But you are a mathematics professor and also a musician, and that was really what drew me to talk to you. I looked at your website recently, and you talk about math, and you talk about music, and you also talk about social connections. So let's start with your music. You learned to play the violin at age 4.
I started when I was 4. And in fact, I play the violin because my older brother chose piano. Those are the two options at the time. He chose piano. I didn't want to do what my older brother did, and so I got the violin.
Okay. What was it like growing up playing the violin? Because obviously you found a love for your music.
It was great. Although, to be honest, I didn't love playing the violin until probably late elementary school, maybe middle school. And that's when I really found that I started to love it. Before that, it was just something that I did. You know, your parents make you do many things, make your bed, clean up things, and one of those things that my parents made me do was to practice half an hour every day on the violin.
I think being a parent is an excellent example of delayed gratification because you spend 15 years telling your child, you need to practice this, you need to practice this, you need to practice this, and fighting with them. And then about 20 years down the road, the lights go off and all of a sudden they realize what a wonderful gift you've given them. Now you studied violin and you played, but you ended up becoming a mathematics professor. What's the connection, if you will, there?
So I think there are a lot of connections between mathematics and music, and sort of on the surface level, we know when we learn music that there are things like quarter notes and eighth notes, and there's mathematics sort of embedded in that language, and you can see that you split a measure up into different parts. That's very mathematical. But I think the connections go much deeper. When you think about child prodigies, there's three areas that you always hear about kids being child prodigies in. One is mathematics,
right.
One is music, and the other is chess.
Right.
You hear about kids being fantastic chess players. And the thing that these three areas have in common is that you can do a lot in math, music, and chess with just patterns. They form the sort of basis for all of these. If you understand patterns and get used to them and sort of manipulate them, you can do a lot of mathematics, you can do a lot of music, and you can do a lot of chess. So I think these math and music in particular are connected at that level. I think there are things that we don't quite know yet about our neural connections, that really it's about pattern matching, about understanding patterns and manipulating them. That's the sort of root connections between math and music.
And when you're talking about math and music and connections, you have a wonderful analogy about piano tuning that really talks about math and of course talks about music as well. Now you're going to have to break it down because it took me a hot minute to grasp what you were saying. So talk about piano tuning.
So if you look on a piano, if you go from one octave to the next, if you go from an A on a piano to the next A, if you look at the frequencies, that's doubling. Every time you go up to the next A, you double. And so you double the frequency, and then from that one to the next one, you double the frequency again. Okay. So it's not that you add the same amount every time, you actually double. So you multiply by 2. So going up octaves, which is what from one A to the next is, that's doubling, multiplying by 2. But if you go from the A to the 5th note on the major scale, so from an A to an E, that's multiplying by 3 halves. And then you could go up from that note to the 5th note on its major scale and go up by 3 halves. And just these two facts, that octaves are doubling and fifths are multiplying by 3 halves, tell you that a piano can never be tuned perfectly in tune. Essentially, you can go from the bottom A on a piano and think about tuning octaves to the top A, and that's 7 octaves. Or you could get to that same note by going up fifths, and you'd have to go 12 of them. And you do the mathematics, and going up 12 fifths, that's 3 halves multiplied by itself 12 times. It's just not the same thing as doubling 7 times.
Oh my goodness. If you just take that example that you gave and you just look at it for what it is, it can be very frustrating. However, if you step back from it, you can see the beauty that is in that by nature of math and music and those connections. And you can realize it's almost a conundrum, if you will, of trying to tune.
And I think you don't really understand Western music, you know, how the Western music changed from sort of Bach's time in through Mozart and through Beethoven and to get to 20th century music. You don't understand that transition if you don't understand the mathematics underlying the piano keyboard.
And you are making those connections for us. We're going to take a quick break. I want to talk a little bit more about that. I want to talk about the Richter scale because I thought that was really interesting as well. Everybody knows the Richter scale measures earthquakes. I want to talk about that. And then I want to move into a really unusual area with you of connections, your math, your music, and social justice, if you will. So we're going to take a quick break as we continue to speak to David Kung from St. Mary's College, a mathematics professor, a musician, and now a classroom social activist, if you will. We're going to take a quick break as we continue with GAB with ALisa Profiles on MetroCast Channel 10. We'll be right back.
Life is a journey. Every day is a chance to do more, be and be better. Hi, I'm Dawn Campbell. Join me on this journey to be your best, whether you're working in a cubicle, managing a full house, or entering a new chapter of life. If you feel good, you look good, inside and out. Join me each week for Be Your Best on MetroCast Channel 10. We can do it together. Be Your Best is brought to you by Burris's Old Town Insurance, an independent agent representing Erie Insurance Group.
In financing, our focus is on saving you money and getting you the best terms. And our customers will tell you that.
I had a bad experience someplace else. All she wanted me to do the minute I walked in wasn't look at cars, was fill out a credit app. So when I came here, they were all about me, not about closing a deal. I feel so compelled to tell everybody that buying a car as a single woman, it can be really fun. My name is Cheryl, and I am an ecstatic Fitzgerald customer.
You're watching GAB with ALisa Profiles on MetroCast Channel 10. Thanks so much for joining us as we profile Dave Kung from St. Mary's College, a mathematics professor, an incredible musician, and moving into the field of educating mathematics students about social justice issues. We'll get there in just a moment. Before the break, we talked about the Richter scale. This was amazing to me when we had this conversation, because one of the things that you mentioned about yourself is that you want people to understand numbers and what numbers mean in everyday language. And I thought that your description of understanding the Richter scale was very poignant.
So if we go back to a keyboard, it's doubling, it's multiplying times 2 every time you go up the same distance. And on the Richter scale, if you look at it, it's not multiplying by 2, it's multiplying by 10. So an earthquake that's 7.0 on the Richter scale versus an 8.0, the 8.0 is actually 10 times worse. So the number that you're reading when you read the Richter scale is actually the exponent on 10. In the same way that in some sense these octaves on a piano, those are the exponent on 2. Mathematicians call this a logarithmic scale. And they come up in a lot of places. So there's the Richter scale. If you look at your sound equipment that's back in your studio, the decibel levels are also a logarithmic scale. If you look at exposure to radiation, that's also a logarithmic scale.
And this is where I think connections are being made every single day in everything in life. And when you talk about the Richter scale, I find that to be a dramatic, I didn't have an understanding of that. You hear that on the news all the time, 4-point this or what have you. And when you think of the difference in scale, it's only going up numbers, one number, but it's actually 10 times stronger.
And if you compare, 6.0 to 8.0, it's 100 times worse, because you get 10 times to get to 7.0 and another 10 times to get to 8.0.
Goodness.
So it's 100 times worse.
Now, because you have such a background in traveling around the world and in languages and in music and in mathematics, you have a lot of information, knowledge, and wisdom to pull from, and that has really helped you in your classroom. One thing that I love, because it is not easy for me, is when you have an educator, not a teacher, but you have an educator who makes a connection between the information they need to provide and what students need to learn to use in the real world, and then they use that to teach their students. You made a connection in your classroom. You teach mathematics. You made a connection as far as what you want your students to understand socially.
So I was sitting at home and I was watching the 2008 elections. And there was a debate between John McCain and Barack Obama. And John McCain turned to the camera and he said, what Senator Obama's not telling you is that under his tax plan, half of all small business profits will be taxed at a higher rate. And Obama came back a minute later and said, under my plan, 98% of small businesses won't see their taxes go up one bit. So you have these two statistics. McCain says half of all small business profits are going to be taxed at a higher rate. And Obama says 98% of small businesses won't see their taxes go up at all. Now,
are both statements true?
So both statements are true, but when you hear those two numbers, you think that one of those two people must be lying. But it didn't take me more than a few seconds as a mathematician to understand those are not contradictory. You could have half of all small business profits going to just 2% of the small businesses. And so those weren't contradictory to me. The slightly depressing thought that I had a minute later was that I had been teaching college mathematics for 15 years at that point, and I had never once taught a kid to do that sort of thinking. And this is very mathematical thinking, and it's math thinking that you need in order to understand the discussion that we're having about policies in the US.
So how do you teach that very broad knowledge base to students?
So I developed a course called Mathematics for Social Justice, and I teach it at St. Mary's College of Maryland every year or two. And the basic idea, my question in developing this course was, what do I think an informed citizen of this country should know about mathematics in order to participate in the democracy that we have? I'm not taking stands on one side or the other. I'm not saying that McCain is right that we shouldn't tax this money, or that Obama is right then that we should tax. I'm just saying those are not contradictory statements. You need to understand that and understand what both sides are saying in order to participate, in order to make an informed choice.
I know you developed an entire curriculum and course around that, but in less than a minute, how do you teach them?
One of the things we do, so we go through various mathematical topics, including things like sampling, including things like dealing with large numbers.
Okay.
When you hear about a $17 trillion federal debt, like what does that mean? But basically, one of the other things that I have students do is I have them regularly read the paper. And every class period, half of the class has to read the paper and highlight something that's sort of mathematical. And the other half of the class has to, at the beginning of the semester, ask a good question about those numbers. Where do those numbers come from? What do they mean? And by the end of the semester, we've turned things around a little bit. So half the class is finding the article and asking the questions, and the other half of the class is trying to answer those questions. That's what I would love to see. I would love to see more people who are critically consuming the numbers and the mathematics that's in the media, and being sort of being critical consumers of the media, so that they are asking good questions and they're pushing the dialogue in this country to be a deeper level, and not just sort of on the surface. I think he's lying. I think he's lying. Trying to decide who is more likable.
When somebody hears a couple of different news clips like you just met, they don't have time to take your class, but they hear these two figures that seem to be contradictory, or almost, in my mind, apples and oranges. What do you encourage them to do, since they don't have time to take your class? What do you encourage them to do to be able to pull out the truth and make an informed decision?
I think that everybody can take a little bit extra time when they hear something like this.
Okay.
And instead of jumping to a conclusion that, because I vote Democratic or I vote Republican, I think he's lying or she's telling the truth, to just dig into the numbers a little bit, to try to understand what are the numbers that they're talking about, what are the statistics, and to understand that every time somebody presents a statistic to you, it comes with their agenda.
Right. And how do you separate statistic, fact, and truth from agenda, hopes, and what have you?
Every time you hear a statistic, you should understand that comes with that person's agenda.
Right.
And you should ask yourself, if somebody were coming from the other side or a different perspective on the same issue, what might the statistics that they would cite look like?
Okay, it's all about making connections.
It is.
We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, I'd like to ask you a really deep question. I'm going to give you a minute to think about it.
Okay.
As a parent and as an educator, what would you say is the singular most important thing that a parent should encourage their child to do or to learn as they're growing? So that's the question when we come back. And then I also would like to talk to you a little bit more about your music, and we have a surprise for you as we continue to profile Dave Kung from St. Mary's College, a mathematician, a musician, and a social activist. We'll be back with more on GAB with ALisa Profiles on MetroCast Channel 10.
Everybody knows Jeep is an American icon. It's fun on the road, off the road, to take you anywhere you want to go. Here at Fitzgerald, we have all the Jeep Chrysler models and our low posted price. There's no hassle, no haggle buying a car here. It's fun. Plus, it's backed up with Fitzway service.
Get 0% APR financing on almost every new 2015 Chrysler, Dodge, and Jeep.
Treat yourself to an American icon. That's the Fitzway. There's just no better way to go.
Life is a journey. Every day is a chance to do more, and be better. Hi, I'm Dawn Campbell. Join me on this journey to be your best, whether you're working in a cubicle, managing a full house, or entering a new chapter of life. If you feel good, you look good, inside and out. Join me each week for Be Your Best on MetroCast Channel 10. We can do it together. Be Your Best is brought to you by Burris's Old Town Insurance, an independent agent representing Erie Insurance Group.
You're watching GAB with ALisa Profiles on MetroCast Channel 10. Can you tell we are getting ready for a really interesting segment as we have profiled Dave Kung, who's a mathematician and a musician. We talked about some of the social aspects, if you will, of math in the community. And when we left, I asked you a question. What do you think, from an academic and also a parent's perspective, is the singular most important thing to teach your child or encourage them to do as they're growing?
So I think, obviously, that's different at different ages.
Right.
But I think in terms of mathematics and music, one of the underappreciated things is that when you get kids to start doing music at a really early age, they're learning more than just sort of the music itself. One of the things that kids are learning at that age is that when you practice, you get better at something, right? And so when you practice an instrument like the violin, you get better, and you can really hear that you're getting better. You can play pieces that you couldn't play before. And I think that those lessons, that when you practice something you get better at it, those are lessons that are valuable, not just in music, but everywhere.
Right.
If you're not doing well in math class, some people have this idea that they don't have a math gene or something like that, which there's no science that indicates anything like that. In great contrast, we know that if you're not doing well in mathematics or you're not doing well in some other class, if you practice, if you put time in and work really hard at that, almost everybody will get significantly better at those things. So I think this is one of these things that, an educational principle, that if we could teach more kids early on, we would all be better off.
And I'm a big one for communication and understanding and really trying to tell somebody what the end result is. And I think if you tell your child, you practice, you will get better. And guess what? When you practice in this area, you will get better, and so forth.
Right. And this idea, that I think we need to try to get away with from this idea that we have these sort of fixed abilities. I'm not a math person. I'm not a music person, right? I don't like history, things like that, right? So all of these we're just sort of giving up instead of saying, you know, right now I'm not particularly good at this particular field, but if I practiced, I would get better.
You can practice math and get better at math.
You can do that.
Okay, I'm going to take you at your word. And that's the whole point of this program, is we would like to talk to people that have a different perspective or do different things. And this particular GAB with ALisa profile is about connections. We've talked about your math, and I want to talk about your music. And we have a really interesting example for you of connections. You've brought in 2 instruments? Is that the appropriate?
This one's definitely an instrument. It's German.
Very clearly, okay.
And so you can play it like a normal violin. Like that.
Beautiful.
And I play violin. I play in the local community orchestra, Cosmic.
Okay.
And you see lots of different instruments there. And if you study these things mathematically, you would come up with equations that describe exactly how a string moves.
Okay.
And so you would figure out those equations, and you could predict things. So you could mathematically say, you know, if I move the string and then let go, you can predict how it's going to sound. And you can predict exactly the sounds it's going to make. And it turns out it doesn't make just one sound. It's making many different pitches. And you can play through these. So when you hear this, you're actually hearing all of these different pitches. You're hearing that bottom note, but you're also hearing this, and this, and this. And an infinite number of pitches all the way up until the limits of your hearing.
Okay.
You're hearing those all at the same time.
That is beautiful.
And in fact, one of the interesting things about mathematics and music is that the mathematics of a vibrating string is exactly the same as the mathematics of a tube. And so a flute can play exactly those same notes.
Okay.
Right? And so, in fact, any tube, including a trumpet or a bugle. A bugle doesn't have any valves, and so it's just a fixed length of pipe. And one of the things that you can play on a bugle, the most common thing you play on a bugle, is, of course, taps.
Right.
So you can play taps on a violin string.
Okay.
It's a little bit hard on that. But you can play taps on any tube of air.
Okay, this is what I was telling you, where we're going to show you something that is very dramatic and unique. And this is the crux of this entire GAB with ALisa profile as we talk about connections. You have to tell our viewers exactly and literally what this is and where it came from.
This is a pool tube. I walked into Leisure World on Great Mills Road and picked out a pool tube, and I swung a few of them around to find the right one, and so this is the best sounding pool tube in the shop.
Swimming pool tube.
Yes.
And you just said that you can make a tube make music. We talked about playing taps. You showed it on the tubes, which are technically the strings on your violin.
And now I'll play taps for you on this pool tube. But you might want to back up a little bit.
Yes.
Not get hurt of this.
you that, or how did you figure that out? Where did that connection come from?
So when you study mathematics and music, one of the things you study are, for instance, flutes and where you put the holes on the flute. And once you think about that, then you can understand sort of the different sounds that you could make on any tube. And so I had seen these, they're little playthings. They're usually shorter. They're for kids to whirl around. They're called whirly tubes. And so I'd heard those. I'd never really thought about the mathematics of those. And when I thought about that, I thought, you could play anything that you can play on a bugle, you should be able to play on a tube like that. And I thought, it doesn't sound very good. The short ones don't sound very good. But of course, if you look at an orchestra, if you come to a cosmic concert, you'll see that the bigger instruments play lower.
Right.
The smaller instruments play higher. And so I thought, if I could get a bigger tube, I could play something in a range that would sound better. And in fact, before I went out and bought a tube, I looked on YouTube and I found some people who play these.
A swimming pool tube.
A swimming pool tube. It does take some practice to get something like taps.
I'm sure that it does. So do you think your mom was wise enough to put you in music and have you start learning the violin at age 4, and then you developed a love for mathematics and an aptitude for practice? Because that's what you said it takes, is practice for mathematics. Do you think that either one of those subjects gave you a bigger heads up in being able to make connections? Do you think one was more important than the other, specifically for you?
I think that music early on gave me a lot of, it exposed me to a lot of things that I think were useful to me far down the road. We talked about practice and the appreciation of practice. But also, I memorized all the music. I started as a Suzuki kid at age 4. And so I memorized all the music I needed to know. And I didn't read a note of music until I was 9 or 10 years old. And at that point, I could probably play for hours without ever looking at any music. And that ability as well, just the ability to memorize things, it comes incredibly in handy.
I'm so glad you said that, because there are different routes to similar successes. And I saw an interview with Mandy Patinkin recently, and if you've ever heard that man sing, he has big voice, and he talks about the fact that he cannot read music. He is a lyrical artist, like many before him, which is to say he hears the words, and the words are how he is able to project a sound in music. And it's similar to what you're saying, is you couldn't read music on a sheet of paper till a later time. And I think it has to do with how your brain makes the connections and how you practice. Then
of course reading music becomes important, but it becomes important at a different time. You can't have 4-year-olds don't read music so well. Right.
All right, well, we really want to take a moment to thank you for what you've shared, for what you're doing in the community. You have an incredible website if people would like to learn more about you professionally, or to learn about your theories as far as understanding math and then taking it to the community and social structures. They can go to your website
and all the connections between mathematics and other fields.
Absolutely, connections. You're a great connection. Thanks so much for joining us with GAB with ALisa Profiles. We hope you've enjoyed today's program as we've spoken to Dave Kung from St. Mary's College, a mathematician, a musician, and a connection maker. That's going to do it for this episode of GAB with ALisa. We'll see you next time. You're watching MetroCast Channel 10.